did you learn in your time, and why do you think this is important?
Yeah, so for me, I've just spent the last 9 years of my career as a civil servant, actually within the Cabinet Office for the last 5. For myself as a civil servant, I was actually based in Derby, and that's where my organisation is set up at the moment. For me, as an individual, as somebody who's now a business owner and entrepreneur, and also somebody who's got a charity locally in Derby and Derbyshire, it's really important that actually I have a say of what's happening with my sort of local policies, actually what's happening with the community, enabling their voice. I'm a huge fan of that sort of what you've just had Andy Burnham talk about there, in terms of having that bottom-up culture change that is really, I think, vital, and actually will give us the innovation and the pioneering we need from people to sort of enable us to thrive. And I think for me, I sort of really came up against the Whitehall culture that Burnham is talking about, in terms of there is this sort of Whitehall is in London, it operates within London, MPs have to be in London from 9 to 5, civil servants have had careers in London for decades, and actually it is going to be relatively impossible to devolve.
And Lauren, just give us maybe a couple of real life examples, or a real life example of how you did come up against some of this kind of Whitehall mentality.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, it's actually a really good example in terms of having Number 10 actually operating outside of London. For somebody like myself, it's actually quite a logical answer in terms of, if it's the operational aspect of Whitehall, and actually if you can do something successfully, again, like having Rishi move out to Darlington and actually set up a Darlington campus for economics, and actually is able to bring in the experts from the local region to enable that. But actually at the time when I was there, when you were sort of going, look, it's actually, the proposal was Birmingham. It's an hour and 20 from London. It's easy for civil servants to zip back in to see their ministers. And actually, again, you're coming up against those logistical challenges of, we've got our families here. It's our MPs that have a culture of us wanting to be next to Houses of Parliament and engage with us there. And so you sort of came up against those logistics, and actually then you've got the other side of it, where you do have your Manchesters, your Glasgows, your Newcastles. Actually what you sort of see with that devolving agenda now, with place leaning in and saying we want more autonomy, and actually having things to
in here. You've got a slightly different view. What are your thoughts on devolution? Because lots of people like this is going to be the saving grace for the country.
Yeah, so I think that there are, many reasons one might advocate for devolution, and some of them might come from principle or potentially ideology. Some research that we've done recently at Public First looks at one of the main ways that, governments across the last decade, both Labour and Conservative, have tried to take on this spirit of devolution and engage in regeneration funding targeted specifically towards areas of the country that feel left behind, so often former industrial areas, coastal towns. And they've spent £19 billion on this endeavour, and that's, not an insignificant sum. That's almost sort of the size of the sports sector in the UK. So £19 billion has gone, and governments from Labour to the Conservatives have sort of targeted the same kind of communities. So Hartlepool, for example, has received £974 a head, which is well over 3 times the England average. They have, historically targeted these areas that are moving towards reform because they feel left behind, because they feel like they're not seeing economic growth and social change, and if anything, a sense of stagnation in their local area. But what we find is that despite the fact that this funding often did go to these places that have turned very quickly to reform, we conducted some matching analysis to say, well, have their political views, have the way they have say they're going to vote changed? And really the answer is that it hasn't. They have stayed quite as angry. They have stayed.
But I suppose that's looking at how people are feeling about politics, which is very important. But has that money actually done good for the area, taking aside, who people are going to vote for in the ballot box? Has this giving away of some money, and I suppose, giving it to local bureaucrats to spend, has that actually improved these areas?
So interestingly, we did some focus groups in both Blackpool and Clacton-on-Sea, and the residents were quite unanimous in saying they did notice that spending was happening. They did notice that there was a new community space.
Sorry, they did notice.
But really what they said is it didn't feel like it was making a difference.
Oh, right, okay.
So they would often see it wasn't a case that the spending wasn't visible, but actually they said it doesn't feel like it's reversing the sense of decline over the last 10 years or 20 years, that it doesn't reverse the sense that crime is increasing, that it's harder to get access to your GP, that it feels that there isn't local growth. Okay. So actually this funding hasn't, made the difference in the end.
So, Lauren, I think one of the things that some of our listeners have messaged in about when we've been discussing devolution before is that the concept seems pretty sensible on many levels in terms of people who are closer to the ground should be able to make better decisions. But a lot of people said that depends on the quality of who is in the ground, because many people look, for example, at their local councils and they don't think their local councils have been doing a particularly brilliant job. You look at a place like Scotland, which has actually got loads of different layers of devolution. You've got your MPs, you've got your councillor, you've got your member of Holyrood, you've got a Scottish government. Hasn't led to brilliant outcomes there. There is an argument from some people that if you have too many layers of sort of political and administrative bureaucracy, does that actually mean that things slip through the net? People don't take responsibility for actually delivering things?
No, and it's a really fair point, actually. You're right. 72% of people at the moment don't trust governments across the board, and that has broken down. I think building on the previous example in terms of actually seeing where the distribution of funds are, and to give a real life example sort of within the system that I operate, is that if you look at the hyper-local level, for example, we've had a lot of funding into the area of Normanton, and that is monies that have been cascaded still at the moment at quite a high level, perhaps combined authority level, which is still it's still relatively national and focused on its governance. And so you do get into that conversation of, well, we've sent millions of pounds of money into that one region. There's that double deprivation, there's a lot of poverty, we need to raise people up. Why isn't it being as effective as it could be? Why are people sort of feeling like they haven't seen the money? And actually what local knowledge will tell you is that actually that community and the communities that live there are relatively transient. So if you sort of have your Afghan communities come in, or if you have a look at your Syrian communities that have come in, or your Iranian or your Ukrainian, and what will happen is that they will be in that sort of part of the city for very sort of 2 to 3 years, sort of bedding in their families, and then what they'll do is they'll start working out where they want their children to go to school, and they'll start getting more significant jobs and start then contributing to the economy, and they will then move out of that area. And actually then you sort of get this cycle of perpetual sort of change within the community. So that poverty doesn't change because the main changes, and that's local knowledge that actually statistics at a local government, national government level wouldn't pick out from the stats and data.
And look, Damayanti, how do you think that because I think we're probably all agreed that we do want to have better outcomes in every postcode, not just London and the southeast or in urban centres, but in towns and rural areas, coastal areas as well. What's the mechanism by which that can happen? Because we all want to see that, and if money is going but people aren't feeling the difference, what's the solution to that?
So I think there are multiple mechanisms that someone like Burnham could pursue. I think the point is more that devolution might not accelerate those mechanisms. So investment into the NHS that translates directly into more access to GP appointments, that's something that comes up again and again in our polling and in our focus groups that we did in Blackpool, Clacton, elsewhere as something people use as a metric, as a kind of bellwether of how they're feeling, how their local area is doing, what their access to public services looked like. So I think national level investment that targets specifically those endpoints that, again, voters say they care about: crime, the NHS, local appearances, local levels of growth and opportunity in ways that are tangible, I think are how you translate into making voters feel like a difference is happening. And it's not just a case of kind of creating a new community space that reverses 10 years of economic headwinds that have left places like Hartlepool, places like Great Yarmouth feeling like they don't have equal access to public services or to economic opportunities.
And look, Lauren, there is an argument that if you remove some of these national targets and you devolve everything. Like, for example, the Labour really criticised the Conservatives for scrapping national housing targets, and they said that's just going to be like a charter for NIMBYism in terms of, aren't there some things which, if a government is really clear that they want to drive this through, they have to do it centrally?
Not necessarily. I think in terms of it's recognising that government really, its greatest success has been convening and actually just being that layer that looks at sort of equity, much rather than getting, it will just land and expand. The government would get too big if it was involved in every single decision, and actually sort of constrain